Hello, it's Toaster Party, and today I'm going to be doing a set review of CEDH cards from Commander Legends 2, Battle for Baldur's Gate. Well, this set is a little bit different than the last set review I did, which was for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. There's actually less CEDH cards from Battle for Baldur's Gate than there was for Neon Dynasty. But that's not really a bad thing, because this set has more of a casual slant, and there's no problem with having a casual slant in a set like this. Without further ado, let's get into the card reviews. Starting off the set review strong with what is probably the most powerful card in the set, Archivist of Ogma. So, this card's incredibly powerful. Out of all of the cards in this set, this is probably the one that is pretty much guaranteed to see CEDH play. It's basically like if Rhystic Study and Opposition Agent were fused together into one card. Because this card is a 2-drop with flash that says, whenever an opponent searches their library, you gain 1 life and draw a card. That's going to probably get you a lot of draws, because CEDH has a lot of searching. And the life gain isn't too bad either, because one of the best cards in the format is Ad Nauseam, so every little bit of life gain that you can get sure helps, and this card is incredible. Up next we have Abdel Adrian and Far Traveler. So there's a new mechanic in Commander Legends 2, that being backgrounds. Backgrounds are enchantments that sort of work similar to the partner mechanic, where you have a commander and a background as your second commander. And with this listing, I put 2 cards on the same listing, because basically you're not going to play one without the other. What Abdel Adrian says is that whenever he enters a battlefield, you exile any number of non-land permanents you control until Adrian Abdel leaves the field, and you make a number of 1/1 white soldier tokens for each permanent that you exile this way. And Far Traveler says, commander creatures you own have at the beginning of your end step, exile up to 1 target tapped creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So basically what this is going to do is that if you have a way to make sure that Abdel Adrian gets tapped, you can tap it, and on your end step you can flicker every non-land permanent on your field if you want, and then you make a 1/1 white soldier creature token for each permanent that you blinked out. So what I see this being used as is a form of rule of law, combat, damage finisher style deck. It's probably not the greatest thing in the world, but hey, it's mono white, and there's far worse things you could be doing with a rule of law deck. Up next, we have Ascend from Avernus. For 3 white and X, return all creatures and planeswalkers with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield and exile Ascend from Avernus. While there's no specific commander that I can think of that really wants this kind of mass reanimation effect, there isn't really any other card that I know of that does this specific thing. And while we don't have a commander that I can think of that wants this right now, this is definitely a card to look at for the future, because this effect is pretty powerful. Going back to that idea of mono-white rule of law, we have Battle Angels of Tyre. You get a 4/4 body for 4 mana with flying in Myriad. Myriad being that whenever you swing at an opponent, you then create a token copy of this swinging at each other opponent that get exiled at the end of the combat step. And oh boy, this is a really powerful card with Myriad, because when this card deals combat damage to a player, that being each of the ones that hits a player, hopefully it would be hitting 3 other players, you get to draw a card if your opponent has more cards in hand than you, you make a treasure if they have more lands than you, and then you gain 3 life if that player has more life than you. So basically, it's a really powerful catch-up card for mono white, and because mono white already struggles to get cards in hand, this is an amazing way to refill your hand. You're probably going to be drawing at least 1, if not 2 cards off of this every time you swing. And because CEDH doesn't really have a lot of ways to block flying creatures, and especially not a lot of ways to be able to fly and or block and kill flying creatures, you're going to get a lot of value off of this, and it's a really effective way to beat down your opponents with rule of law effects. Up next, we have Elaine Harbury's Busybody. This is a 4-drop legendary human peasant with choose a background. That's a 2/4 that says, tap this to look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of tokens you created this turn. Put one of those cards into your hand, on the rest onto the bottom of your library in a random order. So, basically this is similar to the commander Florian from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, except instead of it being the amount of damage opponents took that turn, it's the amount of tokens you created this turn. And instead of exiling it and you can play it till end of turn, it's just added to your hand. It's 1 mana more, but it's a effect that has shown to be good enough for CEDH in the past, and because you can choose whatever secondary color you want, there's definitely a combination out there that will make use of this card. Up next, we have Wyrm's Crossing Patrol. It's a 1/1 with Myriad for 1. Basically, the only deck that wants this is probably just Tymna, because you are then getting, on turn 1 you put this down, turn 2 you put Tymna down, and then you're drawing 3 cards. It's just powerful in the early game, but I'm not super sure if every single Tymna deck is going to want Wyrm's Crossing Patrol, but it's definitely an interesting card to look at for Tymna decks. Up next, for the last white card, is Rasad in Bashir. A 3-drop that says each creature you control assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. Whenever it attacks, if you have the initiative, double the toughness of each creature you control until end of turn, and choose a background. This is another commander I see being really powerful as a rule of law commander, where you can also choose a background that aids in that strategy, because unlike Adrian, this one is pretty open-ended. But it also requires you to run a lot of creatures with high toughness, but thankfully Mono White has quite a large number of those. And it has the additional bonus of, if you somehow are able to gain the initiative, you get to double each creature's toughness that you control until end of turn, making it much easier to take out all of your opponents. For those who don't know, initiative is essentially like the Monarch effect, except instead of drawing a card at the end step if you control the initiative, you venture into the dungeon one. There's a few pretty good cards with this effect, so there's definitely a good likelihood that Rasad could be able to see some form of CEDH play. With our first blue commander, we have Imoen, the Mystic Trickster. For 3 mana, you get a 2/3 with Ward 2 that says at the beginning of your end step, if you have the initiative, draw a card, and draw another card if you completed a dungeon. This looks like it'll probably be a pretty good draw-go commander. The only issue with it is that you require to have the initiative or to have completed a dungeon to be able to get the card at the end of each of your turns. If there's enough ways to be able to get the initiative and to complete the dungeon really fast, then this card is probably going to be really good. Up next, we have Gale, Waterdeep Prodigy. This one for 3 mana is a 1/3 that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery card from your hand, you may cast up to 1 target card of the other type from your graveyard. If a spell cast this way from your graveyard would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. So basically, it's a little bit worse of a Snapcaster Mage from the Command Zone, because you only get the effect if you cast an instant or sorcery card from your hand, and then you have to have the other type in your yard. The good part is that this isn't a once per turn effect, so if you do have a lot of good instants in hand and good sorceries in yard, you can be able to chain a lot of them together. And there's a lot of rituals that are both instants and sorceries, so that could be a very powerful thing to do with this. But I haven't thought fully through on exactly how to be able to put this together to be able to do a combo with these two things. But there's almost a surefire way to be able to do a combo with an instant in hand and with a sorcery in graveyard, or some combination of this effect. It's a powerful effect, and I'm pretty sure there's something here. next we have Candlekeep Sage. This is a background that's in blue for 3 mana that says commander creatures you own have, when this creature enters or leaves the battlefield, draw a card. So this is not the most interesting background in the universe, but what it is a pretty efficient way to get a few cards drawn if you don't have another good option for what you want to be playing with whatever your commander is. And it's in blue, so if you have a commander that wants to be in blue and you need a very generic background to attach to it, this one will probably do just fine. And there's probably maybe some deck that exists out there that really wants to be able to blink things a lot with a background. Hey, maybe there's a Abdel Adrian Azorius deck that wants this. Not too sure about that, but hey, it might be something you could think of. Up next we have Shameless Charlatan, another background for 2 mana that says commander creatures you own gain, pay 2 generic and a blue, this creature becomes a copy of another target creature. So if your choose a background commander isn't good enough, you can basically turn it into a Tymna. That's basically what this is going to be used for. You're going to be turning your commander into a Thrasios or a Tymna. There might be some other creatures you'll be doing it for, but those are probably the most surefire ones you're going to be changing your commander into. Up next we have my pick for what is probably the most powerful choose a background commander from the entire set, that being Volo the Itinerant Scholar. For 2 generic and a blue, you get a human wizard that's a 2/3 that says, when Volo enters the battlefield, create Volo's Journal, a legendary colorless artifact token with hexproof that says, whenever you cast a creature spell, note one of its creature types that hasn't been noted for this artifact. Then you can pay 2 and tap Volo to draw a card for each creature type noted for target permanent you control named Volo's Journal. So basically what this card would be used for is some form of ISO Rev shenanigans. If you can just get 1 card under the journal and you can start tapping Volo, you can then just draw through your entire deck. And there's a good number of ways to give it haste, so you can be able to do that the turn it comes down. And the fact is that the ISO Rev stuff can all be done with the blue portion of the card, so you can then attach any other secondary color that you need to be able to make the best deck possible. Up next, we're starting off black with a background card. Criminal Past. For 2 generic and a black, you get commander creatures you own have menace, and this creature gets +X+0, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So basically, it gives evasion and a lot of power to a creature. So this is another card to consider for attaching to Rule of Law commanders, where you can pump up your commander to be incredibly hard to block because it requires 2, and it can get really big really fast, which would help be able to close out a game via commander damage. If killing your opponents with commander damage isn't your thing, then another good black background is Scion of Halaster. This one says commander creatures you own have the first time that you would draw a card each turn. Instead, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one of them into your graveyard and the other back on top of your deck, then draw a card. Because it's 2 mana, it's not too hard to get down, and every turn afterwards you get to basically get a bit of extra card selection. It's not card advantage, but card selections can sometimes be just as good, and sometimes there's cards you want to get in your yard, so this could be good for those style decks as well. Something like Protean Hulk type combos, if you have a green commander that you want to do with that. Though from here, there's not a lot of good green commanders you'd want to choose. Up next we have Agent of the Iron Throne. Yeah, black has a lot of good backgrounds, but not a lot of good anything else in this set for CEDH. So this one says, commander creatures you own have, whenever an artifact or creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. there is one thing easily that you could do with this card. That being, it is a outlet for infinite dockside shenanigans. So basically, if you're able to do some loop like dockside and Cloudstone Curio, you can then just sack a treasure, paying an opponent or ping your opponents for 1 damage, and then because it's a infinite loop, you'll be able to ping them for enough to be able to take them out of the game. So yeah, it's an outlet for dockside. So if you have a red commander, this is probably the black background you want to pick. Up next we have Zentharim Bandit, a halfling rogue 2/1 that says whenever this card attacks, you may pay 1 life, and if you do, create a treasure token. So you're probably not going to want to run this in decks where you have access to green, because then you're probably making mana in other ways. But if you need to be able to make additional mana to be able to speed into an ad nauseam win, then there's probably a lot worse you can be doing than Zentharim Bandit, because it is a card that's able to generate a treasure every single turn, and it doesn't have to connect to do it. So if you have open opponents, you can get more than 1 treasure over the course of a few turns, if you have enough turns to be able to do so. But it's an overall pretty decent card that I believe some CEDH list will want to use. Here we are with the last black card, that being Pack Weapon. As long as Pack Weapon is attached to a creature, you do not lose the game for having 0 or less life. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, draw a card and reveal it. The creature then gets +X/+X, and you lose X life, where X is that card's mana value, and to equip, you discard a card. So this is another card in the long line of cards that prevent you from losing the game if you have 0 or less life. Alongside that, you have Angel's Grace and Phyrexian Unlife. So hopefully by now we've hit a critical mass of these to the point where the preventing yourself from dying after you've lost all your life, paired with ad nauseum to draw your entire deck, is then a possibly viable strategy. That is probably one of the only places you'd want to play this card. There might be some other deck you would want this in, but that's probably the main place you'd want it. For our first red card, we have Reckless Barbarian, a 2-drop Dragon Barbarian 2/2 that says sacrifice it, add 2 red. So this is similar to Blood Pet type effect, where you sacrifice and you get the mana you paid for it back. So it's basically you store mana up for another turn. This probably will see play in something like Burgi. There's probably a number of other decks that want this kind of effects where they need to be able to store mana for an ad nauseum turn. Like maybe Florian would want this because it gets you 2 mana 1 turn, it's a swinger, and then you're able to sack it and pay 2 red for your ad nauseum. It's not a great card, but it's probably good enough to see play in some decks. For our first red background, we have Guild Artisan, which is a 2-drop that says commander creatures you control have, whenever this creature attacks a player, if no opponent has more life than that player, you create 2 treasure tokens. So yeah, basically, this is a card that generates you a lot of extra mana, as long as the player with the highest, or the opponent with the highest life total, doesn't have a lot of blockers. You're going to be creating 2 treasure tokens for that, which, basically, if you already have your commander out and then you play this card will pay for your swing with your commander. You just have to have a commander big enough that this will matter. Up next, we have Street Urchin. This is probably the best red card, if not the best background in the entire set. This one is a 2-drop that says commander creatures you own have pay 1, sacrifice another creature or an artifact. This creature deals 1 damage to any target. So, as I mentioned before in the black card set review, this card it combos with Dockside. And the fact is, this one is also in the same colors as Dockside. So if you're able to get that infinite dockside loop and have infinite treasures, you can then just use this as an outlet to be able to shoot all your opponents with dockside. The reason why this is better than the black one is that if you have any other commander and it's not in red, you can just attach this and then you have access to infinite dockside combos. The other one is good only if you're already in red. So, yeah, this card's pretty great. Up next, we have Wild Magic Surge. For 2 red mana, you get an instant that destroys target permanent and opponent controls, and then they flip the cards in their deck till they hit a permanent that shares the same card type with that permanent. They then put that card onto the battlefield, and the rest of the cards on the bottom of their deck in any order. So this is basically Chaos Warp 2.0, but it might be a little bit better, and at least it's a bit more applicable because you're able to hit any permanent type, and it's for 1 less mana. So the decks that already were running Chaos Warp in their CEDH lists, which is probably exclusively mono red because every other color pairing probably has a better way of dealing with things. This is probably just a strict upgrade over that because it's 1 mana less to do the same effect. Though if you're hitting something like an enchantment with this, odds are you're probably going to hit a just as dangerous enchantment in a CEDH deck. So if you hit a Rhystic Study, you're probably going to flip into something like Necropotence. Though technically you could hit your opponent into Underworld Breach, and if you do this on a turn that's not theirs, then they'll feel pretty bad. If for some reason playing a Dockside combo doesn't work in your red or your Splash Red deck, then Tavern Brawler is probably the background for you. This card gives commander creatures you control the ability to exile the top card of your deck at the beginning of your upkeep. That creature gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is that mana, the value of the card, and then you may play that card this turn. So it's basically you get an extra card every turn and your commander gets slightly bigger. As long as you control your commander, that is. So it's overall pretty decent, and if you, for some reason, can't run that Dockside combo, then this is perfectly fine. Up next, we have Young Red Dragon. The actual text of this card as a creature doesn't matter, because the only part of it that matters is the pay 1 generic and a red to make a treasure token as its adventure effect. So this is basically a slightly worse version of a card that came out in MH2 that for 1 red creates a treasure token on a sorcery with flashback, which was really good in Kraken Sakashima. This is a little bit worse than that, but it still might be good enough to see play in that deck. The green section might be very short, but it does have a very powerful card in it, that being Master Chef. For a green background, you get commander creatures you own have this creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, and other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter onto them. This card is basically an enabler for an infinite combo with creatures with Persist. Persist being the mechanic that says whenever this creature would die, return it to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter if it didn't have one already. This card just basically cancels out that -1/-1 counter and basically turns them into infinite sack fodder. So yeah, another 1-card combo with, as long as you have, well, 2-card combo as long as you have a sack outlet and the creature to sack. For the final green card on this list is Jaheira, Friend of the Forest. This is another choose a background card, but its ability is tokens you control have tap to add a green. It doesn't say creature tokens, so basically if you make any type of token whatsoever, whether that be treasure tokens, clue tokens, food tokens, they're all suddenly going to turn into Llanowar Elves. And that will probably be able to get you to some form of win very fast because there's a lot of really efficient token generators, and as long as you can get this card onto the field really quick, which shouldn't be too hard if you're in green, you should be able to pull off some really fast wins with this commander. And you can splash whatever second color you want to be able to perform whatever type of infinite combo you need to be able to perform with this commander. Now for the first of the multicolored cards, we have Mahadi Emporium Master. For a generic, a black and a red, you get a cat devil that at the beginning of your end step, you make a treasure token for each creature that died this turn. So, Prosper's a really powerful commander, and this card isn't really Prosper. But it does provide a very interesting effect where if you have a lot of creatures dying during your turn, you're going to be able to make a lot of mana, and because it's in the colors black-red, you can probably get to a ad nauseum the turn after this effect resolves. It just has to survive that turn. Up next we have Nalia de Arnis. For one generic, a white and a black, you have a human rogue that says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard spells from the top of your library. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain death touch until end of turn. Orzhov doesn't have a lot of very good competitively viable commanders, aside from Tymna, and this is probably one of the other few black and white commanders that has an effect powerful enough to be able to play on its own as a commander. It's basically a future side effect for clerics, rogues, and warriors and wizards, and there's a lot of good cleric, rogues, warriors, and wizards. I believe Tymna herself is actually a cleric, so there's definitely a lot of value you can get off that. And while the full party portion of this card probably isn't going to trigger much in a CEDH game, maybe if a game comes down to combat damage, you'll be able to win that race by pumping up your team slowly but surely every single turn. On to the final section, that being the colorless section. We'll be starting us off with Nautiloid Ship, a 4-drop vehicle with flying that when it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. And whenever this card deals combat damage to a player, you may put a creature card exiled with Nautiloid Ship onto the battlefield under your control. So you're probably only ever going to use this in something like Mono White, where you need access to other powerful cards that your color doesn't normally have. And being able to steal an opponent's graveyard full of stuff in a game that goes long, something that Mono White wants already, is probably a good way to be able to help win that race and get additional advantage. And the fact that it's pretty big with evasion for a pretty reasonable crew cost is a nice added bonus. Up next we have a bit of a strange one with Vexing Puzzle Box. This is a 3-drop artifact that you can tap it to roll a d20 and add 1 mana of any color. And whenever you roll 1 or more dice, you put a number of charge counters on this card equal to the result. You can then tap it to remove 100 charge counters from this card, search your library for an artifact card, put that card onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So this is definitely not the most powerful tutor effect in the universe. And the only place that probably would want this kind of effect is Mono White, where they can A, play Rule of Law to slow the game down, and B, they don't have enough tutors in the first place, so getting to be able to just force one onto the field with the 100 charge counter effect isn't too hard to be able to pull off. We might as well call the colorless section the Mono White section, because the final colorless card, Monty Servant of Lekoo, is another card you probably only want to play in Mono White. For a 3-drop, you get a Crew 4 Trampler with Ward, discard a card, that whenever it becomes crewed for the first time each turn, and it was crewed by exactly 2 creatures, it gains whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw 2 cards until the end of turn. Card advantage in Mono White is very hard, and this card's ability to draw cards isn't too hard to pull off in Mono White, and Rule of Law makes cards that normally seem bad like this CEDH playable. Well, that's all I had to say for today. Thank you all for watching. Hope you leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope you all have an excellent day.